Martha Washington outlived all four of her children. At 26, she was one of the richest widows in Virginia, living inside a plantation world built on slavery. Then she married George Washington, and America had a president, but no First Lady role. So Martha invented it in real time, survived the Revolution's winter camps, and after George died, she made a move that shocked even her own household. Why? Welcome to her time unfolded, where the sources lead and the myths step aside. Today, Martha Washington. If you love source-based storytelling, like, share, and subscribe. It helps me make more of it. Her time begins here. Martha Washington was born Martha Dandridge on June 2, 1731, at Chestnut Grove Plantation in New Kent County, Virginia. She entered a world of tobacco fields, river trade, and strict social hierarchy. Her father, John Dandridge, was a Virginia planter who had emigrated from England. He owned roughly 500 acres of land along the Pamunkey River and held respected positions in the community: clerk of the county court, militia colonel, and vestryman in the local Anglican church. Her mother, Frances Jones, came from a politically connected Virginia family. Through inheritance, she brought land and enslaved labor into the household. Martha was the eldest of 8 children. She had 3 brothers, John, William, and Bartholomew, and 4 sisters, Anna Maria, Frances, Elizabeth, and Mary. With one sister born 25 years after her, Martha grew up helping raise younger siblings. From an early age, she learned responsibility, discipline, and the quiet authority expected of a firstborn daughter in a planter household. Unlike many girls in Colonial Virginia, Martha learned to read and write. She read the Bible and devotional texts, but also novels and magazines. Later in life, she would write numerous letters, some of which still survive. Her education, however, was not academic in the modern sense. It was practical. She was trained to manage a household, overseeing domestic work, sewing and needlework, preparing food, growing vegetables, caring for animals, mixing herbal remedies. In 18th century Virginia, the mistress of a home was expected to command order over family, servants, and enslaved workers alike. She also learned social grace. She studied etiquette. She learned to dance. She mastered conversation, and she became an excellent horsewoman. One story tells of her riding a horse up and down the stairs of her uncle's home, a daring act that earned admiration rather than punishment. She left behind no childhood diaries, no memoirs, no confessions, but the evidence of her life shows this clearly. By the time Martha Dandridge reached adulthood, she was already trained in authority, composure, and command. She had been raised not simply to live in Virginia society, but to lead within it. At 18 years old, Martha Dandridge married a man nearly twice her age. His name was Daniel Parke Custis. He was 38, one of the wealthiest plantation owners in Virginia, an heir to a fortune built on land, tobacco, and nearly 300 enslaved people. Their wedding took place on May 15, 1750. His home was called White House Plantation, set along the Pamunkey River. It was not a small household. It was an empire. But this marriage almost didn't happen. Daniel's father, John Custis IV, sat on the governor's council and controlled vast estates. He opposed the match at first. The Dandridges were respectable, but not powerful enough. So Martha did something bold. She met him herself, and somehow she changed his mind. Soon after, she stepped into one of the most powerful families in the colony. Over the next 7 years, she gave birth to 4 children: Daniel, Francis, John called Jackie, and Martha called Patsy. 2 died before childhood truly began. In the 18th century, grief was common, but that did not make it easier. Then, in July 1757, Daniel Parke Custis died. He was only 45. Martha was 26, widowed, and now responsible for 5 plantations, 17,000 acres of land, hundreds of enslaved people, vast tobacco operations, London merchants waiting for shipments. She inherited direct control over 1/3 of the estate. The rest was held in trust for her surviving children. Overnight, she became one of the wealthiest women in British America. Not a social ornament, a manager, a negotiator, a landholder, and a widow. She had buried 2 children. She had buried a husband, and she now stood alone at the head of a plantation empire. Virginia noticed, and not long after, so did a rising officer named George Washington. In the spring of 1758, George Washington rode 35 miles from Williamsburg to visit a wealthy widow. Her name was Martha Dandridge Custis. He already knew the rumors. 26 years old, 17,000 acres, nearly 300 enslaved people, one of the richest women in British America. But this was not just about money. George was rising fast. He had fought beside British forces in the French and Indian War. He stood over 6 feet tall. He carried himself like command came naturally. Yet he was not among the top planter elite. Martha was. Their first meeting was on March 16, 1758. He returned again 9 days later. Within months, plans were forming. He began renovating Mount Vernon. She ordered wedding garments from London, including slippers dyed a bold purple and a gown described as grave but not extravagant. This was not reckless romance. This was 2 powerful futures aligning. On January 6, 1759, less than 10 months after their first meeting, Martha Dandridge Custis married Colonel George Washington. She became Martha Washington. Her wealth strengthened his social position overnight. Her management skills strengthened his estate, and Mount Vernon became their shared stage. By April 1759, Martha left her childhood world behind and moved north to Mount Vernon. The estate sat high above the Potomac River, elegant, expanding, under renovation, and always busy. The household included the enslaved people she brought from the Custis estate. Their labor sustained the refined life expected of Virginia's elite. George managed land and political ambition. Martha managed the household, guests, and daily order. But one quiet truth shaped their private life. They never had children together. Instead, the center of Martha's world remained her 2 surviving children from her first marriage. John, called Jackie, and Martha, called Patsy. George embraced them as his own. He ordered toys from London, oversaw tutors, planned their futures carefully. Martha supervised their early education herself. She was not ornamental. She was attentive, watchful, protective. Around age 12, Patsy began suffering violent seizures. Epilepsy. In the 18th century, there was no cure. They tried physicians, mineral springs, folk remedies, prayers. Nothing worked. On June 19, 1773, after a severe episode, Patsy died at 17. George later wrote that the loss reduced Martha to the lowest ebb of her misery. In 1775, George Washington was named commander of the Continental Army. War meant distance. Martha chose otherwise. She traveled to the winter encampments, shared the cold, the shortages, the uncertainty. Her presence steadied more than her husband. She hosted officers, visited soldiers, helped hold morale together when frayed. She made the commander human. Then, in 1781, another loss. Her son, John Jackie Custis, died after serving near the war's final campaign. Grief followed her again. George and Martha took in Jackie's children, raising their grandchildren at Mount Vernon. By then, she had buried every child she bore, yet she remained standing. After independence, America had a president, but it didn't yet have traditions. When George Washington became the first U.S. president in 1789, Martha became the first woman to occupy the social role we now call First Lady. And here's the cinematic truth. There was no script. So Martha became the script. In New York and later Philadelphia, the Washingtons hosted formal public gatherings, often called levees. The word itself felt royal to some Americans, and these events became controversial because the new republic feared anything that looked like a king's court. But the purpose was real: to make the presidency look stable, respectable, and legitimate. Martha's gatherings also brought together a wide mix of political figures and social groups, creating a space where the new nation's leadership could interact. Even Abigail Adams, watching from the inside of early American power, described Martha as an object of veneration and respect. Still, Martha privately disliked the spotlight. The public role came with constant expectations and little freedom. She was building an institution while longing for home. After leaving the presidency in 1797, George and Martha returned to Mount Vernon, hoping at last for quiet years together. 2 years later, on December 14, 1799, George Washington died suddenly after a severe throat infection. The nation mourned. Martha was devastated. Now she faced a second widowhood at 68. She closed the bedroom they had shared and moved upstairs. In his will, he directed that the enslaved people he personally owned would be freed after Martha's death. But many enslaved people at Mount Vernon were dour slaves tied to the Custis estate and could not be freed by Washington's will. Then Martha made a major choice. She signed a deed to free Washington's enslaved people earlier, and their freedom took effect on January 1st, 1801. And finally, on May 22nd, 1802, Martha Washington died at Mount Vernon. She was 70 years old. She was laid to rest beside George, on the grounds of the estate they had both shaped through war, grief, duty, and history. But her story did not end there. Martha Washington was not a president, yet she helped define what a president looked like to a watching world. She was a mother who endured unimaginable loss, a wartime companion who shared the cold of the Revolution, and the woman who quietly shaped the public role that would one day be called First Lady. She never sought history. History moved into her house and never truly left. America remembers George Washington as the father of the nation, but Martha Washington helped shape the nation's first public face. To support documentaries like this, please like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell. Who should we cover next? Comment below. Thanks for watching.